Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me, and thank you to Adams Memorial Library for hosting this program. I understand it's pretty cold in the Pittsburgh area. We're going to be going at least virtually to some warmer places tonight. And the topic is borders. And this is something that's fascinated me, or I think since childhood, when I went on vacations with my parents from the UK, where I grew up, to France and Spain and Italy. And we were always crossing borders, and I just loved the thrill of doing that. But then, as my life developed and I became an academic, I started thinking about borders, shall we say more broadly. Are they simply walls and fences and border posts? Or can we think of them in other ways? I also started to think about the borders that exist within countries, physical, economic, and social, and then also kind of what I'm calling the borders of our minds. And this presentation's based on the final chapter of my book, Postcards from the Borderlands, the way we think about unfamiliar places. So I'm not going to read the list here, but these are some of the places I've traveled to in the last 25 years or so. I've been working as a teacher, trainer, consultant, researcher, mostly for international agencies, most recently for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. And so in the process, I've crossed a lot of borders. And as I travel, I write. I write email essays to a list of family and friends, and I can invite you to join my email list at the end of the program tonight. And eventually, this has produced 3 books. The first on Central Asia, a region where I lived for almost 2 years and have visited many times. The Indian Ocean region, which has been more the focus of my recent work. And then, Borderlands, the latest book, really wanders around from Asia to Africa to Russia to a bunch of other places, sort of bringing together some of these experiences. We're going to be going to Africa, Central Asia, and South Asia tonight. But we're going to start on, shall we say, more familiar ground. Now, is it okay to make jokes about New Yorkers to a kind of a Western Pennsylvania audience? I assume it is, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, so, we all know that New Yorkers have an inflated opinion of their city and its influence. And I mean, this has been satirized a number of times here, but there's a famous New Yorker cartoon. And, it kind of shows, a conception of borders. And, there are lots of research studies that show that we tend to have maybe an exaggerated view of the borders of our regions or communities and perceive them as more important than more distant places. So this is satirized here. I mean, the rest of the United States is just a couple of city blocks long, it's sort of just all out there. And then Japan, China, Russia, vague specks on the horizon, 9th and 10th Avenue, the Hudson River, the borderline of civilization. This is not a new concept. This is a 1932 map from an artist called Daniel Wallingford. And he sold this by mail order, but you'll kind of sort of see that, Manhattan and Brooklyn sort of occupy this huge area. And, the vacation land of Florida is really just south of Staten Island. Out as you get further west, states kind of wander around there. I was doing a presentation to a library in Illinois the other night, and we sort of see how much Illinois sort of wandered off into an outlandish location. But, it's fun, but I think it does tell us something about the way in which we perceive the borders of our communities, our cities, and our states. So I'm now going to switch to another perspective about the United States, and this is a Soviet perspective. So let's see, we've got somebody else to admit here. Oh, I'm doing double duty. Let me just, oops, come on, map, move, please. Here we go. Okay, so, just one floor down from my office, I've got a large Soviet school map of the United States, and this is just one section of it. I don't know, Latrobe is not in there, but Pittsburgh certainly is. And this was a Soviet school map that portrayed the economic history of the United States from about the end of the 19th century to the early 20th century. I picked it up at a bookstore in Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, in the mid-1990s, and I had a little fun getting it out of the country because the customs officials wanted to confiscate it. And I argued with them a bit that this was not a rare cultural artifact. And so they seized something else from my suitcase and sent me on my way. But you know, I bought it out of interest. I didn't speak much Russian. I didn't know much Russian at the time. But when my Russian improved, I was able to look at this map in more detail. And I don't know if anybody out there knows any Russian, but I'll just explain a couple of things. The legend on the right shows mineral deposits, coal, oil, Железные rudy, which is the iron ore deposits. So those are marked on the map. The thing that fascinated me was all of these red flags. Oh, what are these? You know, much larger than the, you know, kind of the things that indicated place names. So I thought about that, and I started looking at the dates underneath. And I think you could look at the Pittsburgh dates Western Pennsylvania, and kind of figure that out for yourself. The Homestead Strike. I mean, what they were doing here was they were telling the history of the United States through the lens of workers' movements, through strikes, labor unrest, on the legend Рабочее движение, literally workers' movements. And so that's where I got that. And so it was kind of fascinating because the most prominent things on the map were these flags. And so the real borders on this map are not state borders or national borders, they're kind of class borders, or the borders between the capitalist bosses supported by the government and the poor working classes. So that was the lens in which the geography and history of the United States were presented to Soviet school children. Now, you may think that all of this went away when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but let me share this map with you, one of my favorite maps. Okay? This is an English version of a map by a Russian academic, a guy called Igor Panarin. And he predicted that just as the Soviet Union had collapsed, so the United States would fall apart and break into 6 regions, each under the domination of a foreign power. And I see Pennsylvania is going to join the European Union, which is just fine because Britain just left it, my former country. So I guess we need that. But, you know, this looks ridiculous in a way, but Panarin was looking at, issues such as immigration, the economy, and he was predicting a collapse of the dollar. He was predicting civil war, and then constructed this map as to what would happen to the United States. It looks very silly, but when I was traveling in Central Asia, former Soviet Union, in the early 2000s, people would come up to me and they said, "When is the United States going to dissolve?" I said, "That's ridiculous. Why are you saying this?" Well, it was because the theory was in pretty wide circulation. So these are the borders of the United States through this lens. And Panarin, as an academic, he kind of predicted actually the risk of disintegration was between 45 and 55%. But as with most of these things, that was left out of the reporting on the issue there. So it looks silly, but is it any sillier than some of the maps we have of other parts of the world? And one on the left is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it kind of pokes fun at our general views of what's happening in Africa: war, famine, disease, conflict. The one on the right, though, I think is actually in some ways more informative, and it's one of a series of maps that have been done which trace what happens. It's kind of the tyranny of Google. What happens? The most common adjectives Google auto-completes in answer to the question, why is such and such a country? Why is Nigeria? Why is South Africa? Why is Kenya so? And it fills in, and we get a lot of poors, a few hots, a few riches, and a few dangerouses there. But again, that sort of feeds into our whole notion of how we classify countries. So, my conclusions here is that we all construct mental maps. Oh, I think my wife's going to take that call. Based on our personal views and maybe our race, ethnicity, and as I studied when I was a history undergraduate in the United Kingdom, and I had to kind of keep up on changing borders in Europe across 300 years, like all these wars. What was going on? Who owned Alsace-Lorraine this week? So there was a lot to keep up on as borders changed. And we got another one there. Oops. I thought I admitted that person there. Okay. Okay, I'm trying to keep an eye on the top of the screen and admit people as they come in. When I picked up the atlas and looked at other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, I started to think about why some countries are strangely shaped and why there are straight line borders. And this kind of gets us to some of the key issues on borders. So let's start in Africa here, okay? And sort of who draw these straight line borders? Well, it was mostly politicians, political leaders sitting around conference tables in European capitals, thousands of miles away from the lands that they were dividing. The French and the British and the Belgians and the Portuguese and Germans and Spanish to a lesser degree, carved up Africa into spheres of influence without any attention to ethnicity, topography, language, culture. They were dividing up the colonial spoils there. And then over the next half century, they started to actually finalize the border lines between countries. I love this quote from the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. We're drawing lines upon maps in places we have no idea about. No white man has ever trod foot there. But that was the way the colonial powers divvied up the continent of Africa. And he was speaking at a convention where the border between the British colony of Nigeria and the French colony of Niger was decided. So these borders cut across grazing lands, ethnic groups, ancient kingdoms, topography. And there's a couple of principles here. This is like the most academic part of the presentation. I don't try not to be too academic. So I'm going to mangle the Latin here. Uti possidetis juris, as you possess under the law. The principle here is that when a country becomes independent or colony becomes independent, it simply keeps its colonial boundaries. That's the easy way to do it. And this is something that originated in South America in the 19th century when the Spanish and the Portuguese colonies were becoming independent. To avoid border wars, they simply said, okay, Argentina, okay, Chile, okay, Peru. You simply keep your Spanish colonial borders. The other principle, one of self-determination, is where people or their leaders decide whether to keep those borders or divide up the colony, usually into smaller parts. And this is one of the reasons why there are so many independence and separatist movements in Africa today, because the colonial boundaries, which have been largely preserved, cut across ethnic groups. So I think these maps illustrate it pretty well. Here on the left, here's colonial Africa, okay, and on the right, post-independence Africa. And there have been a few changes, yes. South Sudan was relatively recently created as a country, but for the rest, the boundaries of the colonial times have been retained. And this principle, uti possidetis iuris, applied with the same rationale to avoid border conflicts. Now, what might have happened if there hadn't been, if the European powers hadn't colonized Africa? This is one of my favorite maps. This is by a Swedish artist, and Nikolai Sion. And what he did was he did a study of Africa, the African continent, just before the colonial powers started carving it up. And in traditional Islamic cartography, the south is the north and the north is the south, if you like it that way. But what he showed was, the boundaries of traditional kingdoms. So we would have had, I think, a lot more countries in Africa, and those have been preserved. So it's what we would call a counterfactual, what might have been. If this had happened, would there still have been border disputes? Probably yes. But it kind of shows one of the reasons why there still are border disputes in Africa, because these were often ethnically based kingdoms. Okay, I'm going to switch areas here. We're going to switch to the Soviet Union. And I guess I'm going to make the argument here that exactly the same thing happened when the Soviet, just as when African colonies became independent from the 1960s onward, the same thing happened in the Soviet Union when it collapsed in 1991. So to make a long story short, Russia, Tsarist Russia, conquered this region in the south, Central Asia, in the late 19th century. The Russian Empire was pushing east into Siberia and south into Central Asia. And the Soviet Union inherited what was Russia at the time. And the Soviets were really worried about ethnic loyalties, and they were worried about Islam. So in Central Asia, an area where I've traveled and worked a lot, they started creating nationalities. They created Soviet Socialist Republics, SSRs, with a defined territory with national borders. Now, all of these SSRs were ethnically mixed. But that was part of the plan there. They didn't want any ethnic group to be dominant in a specific area and thus threaten the stability of the Soviet Union. So they were constantly shifting around nationalities. I spent a lot of time in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and ethnically the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs are not too different. And kind of my joke is that when the cartographers drew the boundary between the Kyrgyz SSR and the Kazakh SSR, they pointed to a shepherd on one hill and said, "You're a Kazakh," and on another hill and said, "You're a Kyrgyz." They were very, very similar. But anyway, these artificial boundaries were drawn. Now, for 3/4 of a century, this made no difference at all, okay? You could move within the confines of the Soviet Union, you could move relatively freely between one Soviet Socialist Republic and another one. But then, when the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, suddenly people in each of these places woke up and found, oh, I am now a citizen of an independent country, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, whatever. And now there are national borders that I cannot cross. So if I'm a herder and I've got sheep and goats and horses, I can't move from my mountain pastures in the summer to my winter pastures. And, I can't travel across the border to go to the market or go to the school or to visit my relatives. Suddenly there are borders set up. But it's the same principle that was used in Africa, where the borders, the colonial borders of the Soviet Union, were then preserved for the new countries. So, one quick example here. This is an area called the Fergana Valley in Central Asia, and the yellowy part is Uzbekistan. And you see how it sort of curls in and out of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan all over the place. This is the gerrymandering to kind of keep ethnic groups in check. And so in southern Kyrgyzstan, in that city called Osh, place I spent quite a bit of time, it's about half the population are ethnically Uzbek. So, this gerrymandering aimed to keep people under control. It didn't matter too much in Soviet times when people could move around, but when Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan became independent countries, then the borders started to matter and you could not cross. So the classic example here of being ethnic conflicts is the road between Osh and Jalalabad, respectively the second and third largest cities in Kyrgyzstan, but divided by a 30-mile stretch of Uzbekistan. And there have been conflicts over water, natural gas. And so when the Uzbeks are not feeling very charitable, they'll close the border or they'll hit up drivers for fines and stuff like that. And so while the quickest route between those two cities, and there's a lot of commerce between those two cities, is 30 miles straight through Uzbekistan, many drivers take the long way around through this little place called Uzgen, simply to avoid the border hassle. So this is the result of those gerrymandered borders drawn in the 1920s by the Soviets to try to keep ethnic groups in check, preserved upon independence and creating problems still today. So, as I said, we'll just end with this. This is sort of the borders of our mind thing here. I traveled a lot in Central Asia in the 1990s and then up to about 2012. And I would come back to my university and people would say, where have you been? I said, Kyrgyzstan. They would say, Kurdistan. I said, no, that's in Iraq and Turkey and Syria. I said, Kyrgyzstan. They went, where? They said, oh, you've just been in Stanland, which is actually, nonsense, because the word Stan in Persian means land. So literally I've been to land. But there's many examples of politicians. I'm trying to keep this one bipartisan here, getting confused about it. And then this wonderful New Yorker cartoon, which sort of uses Yiddish and Middle Eastern names and imposes them on the 5 boroughs. So, it's a place where our notions of borders are still pretty vague. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what I describe as the most tragic border story, the partition of British India in 1947. And the difference here is that while in Africa and I guess later in the Soviet Union, this principle of uti possidetis juris, the colonial boundaries were kept, became the boundaries of the new countries. In British India, religion was used as the single factor to divide up the country on independence. So British India was cobbled together over a period of about 150 years by the British East India Company, which started off as a trading group but kind of developed into a rather mercenary military outfit. But after World War II, when it became clear that British India had to become independent after the independence movement led by Mahatma Gandhi, all parties basically agreed independence has to come. So at independence, India consisted of 8 large provinces, 5 smaller ones, and a total of 565 princely states. Now, if you had followed the principle that was followed in Africa, a state like Hyderabad would have become an independent country, and that's what its ruler, the Nizam of Hyderabad, that was his official name, wanted. He said, look, we can be a valid country on our own, and probably so. I mean, Hyderabad in land area was about as large as Britain itself. It had a population of 16 million and an economy the size of Belgium, a viable country. However, most of the princely states were much smaller than Hyderabad. So if you'd applied that principle of using colonial boundaries, you'd have created around 600 new countries in British India. And that would have been, I don't know, political, economic, cartographic train wreck, I guess. So in the end, these princely states decided to join either India or Pakistan based on their religion. Primarily they would go to India, primarily Muslim go to Pakistan. And the problem, though, was in several parts where there was a strong mixed population. So we're going to look here at Bengal, again, an area I've spent a lot of time in Bangladesh recently and got really interested in the country. So Bengal was a large British province, fairly prosperous, and it was mixed in terms of religion, Hindu and Muslim. And the British in 1905 had tried to divide it up into a mostly Hindu West Bengal and a mostly Muslim East Bengal. And there'd been, people did not like that because Bengalis were more united by language and culture than they felt divided by religion. Bengal was the site of the Bengal Renaissance, a major 19th and early 20th century literary movement that produced a Nobel Literature Prize winner. So Bengal, was certainly, like Hyderabad, viable as a country, maybe even more. But because the decision was religion has to religion has to define the borders, this is what happened. The British sent out this guy, Cyril Radcliffe, poor Cyril, who had no experience in India, and he was given the task of drawing the boundaries. And the problem was in 3 provinces, Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, and Bengal, with roughly the same numbers of Hindus and Muslims. And he had to draw the lines, and he was working with outdated data and on a terribly short timeline. He was given, he was literally given about 6 weeks to do the job. And so when they announced the line in August 1947, in places the borders ran through villages, sometimes through the middle of houses. And this led to lots of people, roughly 12 million people, trying to move, massive communal violence. It was a hurried decision, and it's one that still haunts us today with communal violence, especially in India. So this created a country called Pakistan. And just look at the map. Pakistan never made any sense, but because of the principle of religion used, this was how it was divided. The Bengalis of what was East Pakistan had very little in common. The only thing they had in common with the Sinds and the other and the Punjabis and others of West Pakistan was religion. Different language, different culture, different traditions, different economy. So, 1,400 miles of India separated East and West Pakistan, and eventually, after the West Pakistan attempted to impose language, their Urdu language on the East, after a period of about 20 years, there was a 9-month liberation war, which led to the creation of Bangladesh. I think showing that the principle of dividing on the basis of religion was a recipe for disaster. So, but the borders drawn by Radcliffe still are problematic today. I think it's fascinating that the border, Bangladesh is almost completely surrounded by India, apart from a small border with Myanmar to the south. And when you add it all up, it's about half as long as the US-Canada border, but it's a very small country, about the size of Illinois or Iowa, albeit with 170 million people, about half the population there. And it used to be even longer because all of these little territorial enclaves called chitmahals in the northwest of the northwest of Bangladesh, and this would be also in West Bengal. And an enclave is part of a country surrounded by another country, a little island within the country. And this got, most of these were quite small, but the problem was there was no problem for many years. When British India existed, people could move in and out. But when the border was created, we had the state of Cooch Behar joined India. It joined India, but also all its little enclaves joined India, and a Muslim majority Rangpur joined Pakistan. So you can sort of see the map here. It's an old map. It looks like there's been a rash along the border. It's got like a nasty skin rash here, and all of these little bits of India are in Pakistan, and all these little bits of Pakistan are in India, which is a mess, but even more of a mess if you live there, because you can't get to a school, you can't get to a health center, you're going to be arrested if you cross the border. And it took until 2015, let's see, 55, almost 70 years after independence, for a land swap to be arranged to hand over, to eliminate all of these enclaves. This is why the economists once called this the world's craziest border. Okay, I'm going to finish with a confession time. My cartographic crimes. Okay, it's time to fess up here. But I make the point here because it's, borders are very important. So I have knowingly violated the 1961 Criminal Law Amendment Act of India, and also I've imported prohibited articles, maps to be particular. So the fuss is about this place, like Bengal, like Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir was one of those religiously mixed states, about half Hindu, half Muslim, that Radcliffe divided up as well as he could. And today, India has a bit over half of the land area, Pakistan a little bit more. China had a war with India in 1962 and grabbed a bit. Now, on official maps in India, the whole province is shown as being part of India. But in fact, something like 30% is in Pakistan, and this thing called the line of control, heavily militarized. India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars over Kashmir. India in particular is very sensitive about this, and any maps in magazines, or produced by neutral parties that purport to show part of Jammu and Kashmir as controlled by Pakistan or as part of Pakistan really set off alarm bells. So Al Jazeera was forced to stop broadcasting for a week or so because some graphic showed a map that showed Pakistan's control of part of Kashmir. In 2016, the government of India briefly floated a draft law that would punish cartographic criminals, including myself, I suppose, with up to 7 years in jail or fines ranging up to $15 million for producing or circulating, quote unquote, incorrect maps. Now, they didn't go forward with that legislation, but it kind of shows the paranoia over borders and maps. So there's a difference, I think, between printed maps where you can show some nuance and some detail and, should we say, the Google view of the world. And let's recognize that Google does have an influence over the way in which people perceive the world and its borders. Now, Google's a business and it has to stay in business. So in order to stay in business, Google, how do I put this, localizes the borders. So if you're in India and you're looking at a Google map of India, you will see all of Jammu and Kashmir as part of India. That's good. But if you're in Pakistan, you'll see a different Google map which reflects more accurately the fact that about 30% of Jammu and Kashmir are actually controlled by Pakistan. So, I mean, I guess the lesson to draw from all of this is that each country, or at least its government, has its own ideas of where its borders lie, and they usually encompass, kind of like the New Yorkers, they usually encompass a larger area than it actually controls, certainly more than's represented on maps drawn by other countries or neutral parties such as international organizations. So increasingly the borders around the world are not only physical borders marked by guard posts, barriers and walls, but they're what interested parties believe and what they portray them in their media as being. So I'm going to just let's stop there. I'll be really happy to. I didn't pull up the chat box here, but maybe Tracy or Adam can relay any questions to me. If you're interested in hearing from me more, and I really write like I talk, fairly informally. I'm doing kind of weekly travel blogs right now. I've got some Central Asia stuff going out. So just send me an email, and I will be happy to add you to my list. But thank you so much for your attention tonight, and I hope this has been as entertaining as anything you might have caught on Netflix at this particular time.
We have one question in the chat, and then I've received a couple questions from others in the group.
Oh, good.
In the chat, Bev is asking, how do you handle language challenges in your travels?
Not very well. No, that's a facetious response. Okay. Yeah, I mean, language is so important. And I mean, there's no way in which, unless one is a very talented linguist, you can learn enough of a language to even get by. What I try to do, and actually my wife is much better at this than I am, is I try to learn, some common expressions, some common phrases, okay? And I think if you show that you're making an attempt there to understand the language and you're interested in the language, people will reach out to you. They'll. Now, obviously, there's I speak pretty good French and reasonable Russian. Okay. So, that helps me in some places there, but obviously there are other places I go to where I have none of the language at all. And so I think learning a few phrases and just being very honest about one's ignorance and being open to people helping you is important. I always try to travel as much as possible with people who do know the language, okay? So because most of my travel has been for work, I'm usually with citizens of the country in which I'm traveling. And that's a huge advantage, because not only do they literally translate for you, this is what this person says, they take it to another level, and this is what it really means, So, I found that, but I've had some interesting experiences. I mean, as I said, my Russian's not bad, but I've worked mostly in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, and I would go into an office for a meeting with somebody, and I would usually have an interpreter with me, and would start off in Russian. But then, if the other people in the meeting didn't want me to understand what was going on, they would switch to their native language, Kyrgyz or Kazakh. So there's these sort of interesting communication dynamics that go on there.
I had a similar.
I have no idea if I answered the question or not, but I rambled a little longer.
That's quite all right. I had the same experience growing up when my mother, who was from Yugoslavia, which is not a country anymore, wanted to talk to without the kids knowing she would speak German. And when she was growing up, her mother would speak Croatian for the same purpose.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
the other question.
we're using language literally as a barrier there. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Someone said crossing physical borders differs based on how their residents conceptualize the borders. She wants to know if, like, crossing from one country into another country, the actual experience of crossing the border, did that differ from country to country based on the locals?
Depending on whether you're a local or whether you're a foreigner? Okay. Okay. Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. If you're a foreigner, you have money, presumably, and therefore you are liable for the special transit visa that you didn't know you had to have. So, I mean, it's I think there's a lot of different. I mean, for example, if you travel within Europe now, well, not exactly now because of the COVID-19 restrictions, but there are very few, no border checks in Europe in normal times. You can drive from Greece to Denmark, okay, without going through a single border check because of something called the Schengen Agreement, a passport-free zone. Now, other parts of the world, it's more difficult. And I mean, any country that starts asking you to pay for a visa and things like that, you know it's going to be more difficult. And there's some interesting tactics to use there. I mean, I try to be open and friendly and not shuffle around too much, but there's an interesting. I mean, one of my colleagues, I was in Madagascar, and we were coming into the airport. It was late at night. We were exhausted, and my colleague, who knows Madagascar well, I mean, speaks Malagasy, he sort of picked up our passports and he put like a 2,000 Ari note into each of them, okay, and he passed them over, and boom, suddenly we were through. And I was sort of a bit uncomfortable about that, but because hey, we're fostering corruption here. On the other hand, sometimes it's kind of what you have to do to get through. And also, I mean, I say corruption, but let me recognize, and this is the same with police hitting you up for fines and stuff like that, these government servants are very poorly paid and not necessarily bad people. They need that extra money to put food on the table for their families. So I mean, you kind of got to put aside some of your, I'll say, moral scruples, but some of your your Western ethical principles in some countries as you navigate.
Someone else asked, I think it may have been one of the people who came in a little bit later, why did you originally obtain that Russian map?
Oh, why did I obtain Russian map? Yeah, okay. Simply because it looked interesting. I had no idea what was on it. Yeah, I bought several maps there. I mean, it was my second visit, I think, to Central Asia, and I was in a bookstore and I went, oh, that looks really interesting. But I mean, the final joke at the airport was as they tried to shake me down for this and that. I said, look, this is a map of the United States. What am I going to do? Plan an invasion of the United States? Come on, you know. So, but I mean, you know, I bought it just on a whim. Now, I mean, I've had it framed because I consider it actually a pretty important, or not important, but not that it's valuable or not, but a pretty revealing historical document in terms
Sure.
of the way in which, you know, Soviet school children were taught about what to think about the United States.
Yep. You kind of blew my mind with the two maps of that Google shows for Pakistan and India. That was pretty incredible.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure there are other examples around there. I mean, there are some countries, I mean, India and China in particular are very sensitive. I mean, China, in fact, I've been some examples there. I mean, you know, I think there was a Chinese passport that sort of showed Chinese, you know, most of, you know, Vietnam and being part of China. You know, it's like, and you know, it's perceptual, yeah.
Yeah. We've got one last comment. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing your expertise.
Well,
So
it's been a great pleasure, as you can probably tell from my attitude. I had a lot of fun doing this. Okay.